The grand ballroom of Thornbury Palace held 30 of the realm's highest nobility, but the air within the gilded walls possessed the particular chill of a house party on its third evening, when the social veneer had begun to crack and the real knives were starting to show. Lady Evangeline Vance stood near the east window, her fingers wrapped around a glass of untouched wine. She watched the room with the predatory grace of a woman who had spent half her life managing egos that didn't know they were being managed. She was 28, unmarried, and according to the whispers of the court, the steady pillar of the Vance bloodline. When her mother died, and her father the Earl looked at her with eyes as cold as flint, he hadn't offered comfort. He had offered a duty. "You are the steady one, Evangeline," he had told her at 14. She understood even then that steadiness was not a compliment. It was a life sentence. Tonight her spine was a blade of steel beneath her sapphire silk gown. She was watching King Alaric Thorne. He was 31, a man built of dark shadows and heavy silence. He moved through the crowd not like a monarch seeking favor, but like a predator measuring the distance to his prey. Alaric had been the king for 5 years, ever since the fever took his father and his younger sister, Princess Alara. Since then, the warmth had left him replaced by a crown that seemed to weigh heavier with every passing season. Evangeline saw him coming toward her. She did not blink. She did not adjust her posture. "Your Majesty," she said as he came to a halt, his presence taking up the oxygen in her lungs. Alaric didn't bother with the customary pleasantries. He looked at her with eyes that were a storm of dark amber. "Lady Evangeline, I believe there is a ledger in my possession that requires an explanation from your own lips." He reached into his royal coat and produced a folded piece of parchment. It was aged, the edges slightly frayed, but Evangeline recognized the ink immediately. It was her own hand. It was the seating chart from the Midsummer Gala 18 months ago, the night Alaric was supposed to announce his betrothal. On that chart, beside the king's seat at the head of the table, Evangeline's own name had been written in bold, elegant strokes, but there was a single violent line drawn through it, a dismissal in black ink. Above it, in a softer hand, she had written another name, Lady Seraphina. "I know that chart," Evangeline said, her voice a calm river over jagged stones. "You crossed out your own name." Alaric's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of regret. "You were the king's choice, Evangeline. The council had agreed. The bloodline was compatible. And yet you handed the seat beside the throne to Seraphina as if it were a discarded trinket." "I did," she replied. "I introduced her to Duke Julian, and I ensured she sat beside you. I did it on purpose." The king went very still. To the rest of the room, they looked like two nobles discussing the vintage of the wine. But beneath the surface, a kingdom was being torn apart. "On purpose," Alaric repeated the words, tasting like ash. "You threw away a crown and spent 18 months ensuring you were never in the same room as me. You gave up your theater box. You declined the winter invitations. You even moved your seat at the Worthington dinner to the far end of the hall just to avoid my shadow. I was managing the court, sire. It is what I am good at." "No." Alaric stepped closer, the scent of cedar and old parchment clinging to him. "You weren't managing the court. You were fleeing from it. You read the evidence of your own deliberate act, and you walked away without a word of justification. Why?" Evangeline set her glass down on a marble side table. The vibration of the crystal against the stone echoed the thrum of her own heart. "Because, Your Majesty, I saw you at the Alderton Garden. I saw you with Seraphina. I saw the way you leaned into her, the way you laughed a real laugh, not the one you wear for the ambassadors. I realized then that a crown is a cold thing to share with someone who is only there because of a contract. I gave you what I thought you wanted." She curtsied, a low, sweeping movement that was more of a shield than a gesture of respect. "If you will excuse me, I find the air in this ballroom has become quite thin." As she walked away, her silk skirt sweeping the cold floor, she felt his gaze burning into the back of her neck. She didn't see Alaric turn back to the seating chart, his thumb tracing the line she had drawn through her own name. He hadn't been laughing with Seraphina that day because of love. He had been laughing because for one fleeting moment, Seraphina had reminded him of the sister he had lost. He had been mourning, and Evangeline had mistaken his grief for a betrothal. But as Evangeline disappeared through the heavy oak doors, Julian the Duke, who had spent 18 months as the intended for Serafina, stepped out from the shadows of the billiard room. "She took the bait, then?" Julian asked, his voice smooth and oily. Alaric didn't look at him. "She took nothing. She simply walked away. She has been protecting us all from a truth she doesn't even fully understand." "And the bloodline, sire," Julian pressed. "The council is growing restless. They want a queen on that throne, and they don't care if it's the one who was meant for it, or the one who stole it." Alaric folded the chart and tucked it back into his coat, right over his heart. "They will have their queen, but they will find that Lady Evangeline Vance is not nearly as steady as she pretends to be when the throne is at stake." Evangeline reached her private chambers, her breath hitching in her chest. She pulled the heavy velvet curtain shut, blocking out the sight of the palace she had tried to give away. She reached into a small, lacquered box on her vanity and pulled out a single-dried Han Hoa EP pressed heather. It was a remnant of the sister Alaric had lost, a sister Evangeline had loved like her own. "I did it for her," she whispered to the empty room. "I gave him up so he wouldn't have to choose between his duty and his heart." But as she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman she didn't recognize. Not the steady daughter, not the dutiful noble. She saw a queen who had been robbed by her own hand, and for the first time in 14 years, the fire of ambition began to flicker in the dark. She wasn't just the one who managed the room anymore. She was the one who was going to set it on fire. The billiard room at Thornbury was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and the scent of expensive tobacco, a place where the men of the court came to trade secrets like currency. Duke Julian stood by the table, his movements practiced and fluid as he ran a cue along the green felt. He looked up when King Alaric entered the heavy oak doors, groaning on their hinges as they closed behind the monarch. Julian didn't bow. He didn't have to. He was the man who had been promised a union with the Vance bloodline, a man who had watched his future queen walk away from the throne and hand it to his own sister Serafina. "She took it well, then?" Julian asked, his voice, a smooth purr that didn't match the predatory glint in his eyes. "She said she knew," Alaric replied, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "She said she introduced you and Serafina on purpose. Then she walked out of the room as if I were nothing more than a ghost haunting my own palace." Julian paused, the tip of his cue resting against the white ball. "She is a creature of management, Alaric. You know this. Evangeline Vance has been the architect of everyone else's happiness since she was a child. But don't mistake her composure for indifference. A woman doesn't cross out her own name on a royal seating chart, unless she is hiding a wound too deep for the court to see." Alaric moved to the fireplace, the low embers casting long, jagged shadows across his sharp features. "I believed she loved you, Julian. For 18 months I sat on that throne believing that she built the match between you and Serafina, just to stay close to you, that she was the silent shadow behind your happiness." Julian laughed, a sharp, jarring sound in the quiet room. "You believed I was the reason, my dear king. You have been drawing your geometry all wrong. I'm going to tell you 2 things, and I want you to listen to both before you let your pride speak." Alaric turned, his jaw locked in a hard line. "Go on." "First," Julian said, leaning against the billiard table with his arms folded. "The introduction was indeed deliberate. Evangeline didn't leave a single element to chance. She steered Serafina into conversations about the botanical societies. She arranged the seating. She even chose the silk for the drapes at the midsummer gala to match Serafina's eyes. She orchestrated my life as if I were a piece on her chessboard. And the second thing, Julian's voice grew steady and deliberate, is that for 18 months, Evangeline has removed herself from every room you entered. Not my rooms, Alaric. Yours." The king went very still. The air in the room felt suddenly cold, as if the winter outside had finally breached the stone walls. "The theater box she gave up in November," Julian continued. "You were in the adjacent box. She told the court she had a headache, but I saw her carriage leave the moment she saw your royal seal, the Christmas invitation to the Winter Palace. She declined it the morning after she learned you would be attending. Every seating adjustment, every skipped gala, every redirected invitation, she wasn't moving toward me. She was fleeing from you." Alaric felt the weight of the crown press into his skull. He remembered the 4 occasions he had watched her navigate a dinner party with such effortless grace, always placing herself at the opposite end of the table from where he sat. He had read it as hospitality. He had read it as her devotion to making the court run smoothly for his benefit. He hadn't realized she was managing her own proximity to the fire. She was managing her distance from me. Alaric whispered more to himself than to Julian. Exactly, Julian said, picking up the cue again. I have been watching this for a year and a half. You believed she loved me. You were wrong. She crossed out her own name, Alaric, not yours. She stood at the edge of the cliff and looked at the throne, and then she jumped into the dark because she couldn't bear to stand beside you while her heart was breaking. Alaric left the billiard room without another word. His footsteps echoed through the silent corridors of Thornbury, past the portraits of kings who had ruled with iron and queens who had ruled with blood. He found himself in the royal library. It was 6 in the morning, the first gray light of dawn creeping through the old window frames. He pulled the seating chart from his coat and laid it flat on the mahogany desk. He looked at the line through her name, the firm, dark ink that felt like a scar on the page. He began to rebuild the last 18 months with the new geometry Julian had given him. He thought of the Alderton garden again. He had been laughing with Seraphina about Princess Alara's badly pressed heather. He had been a man in mourning, reaching for a memory of a dead child. But Evangeline had been watching. She had seen the laughter and the intimacy, and she had concluded that he had found a new queen. She had given him Seraphina, not because she thought they suited, but because she thought he wanted her. And because she loved him, she had decided to become invisible. You fool! Alaric breathed, his fingers trembling as they touched the parchment. You magnificent, self-sacrificing fool! Across the palace, in a small room, overlooking the frozen gardens, Evangeline was not sleeping. She was sitting at her writing desk, a single candle burning low. She had begun a letter 3 times and burned it 3 times. She didn't know who she was writing to, only that the weight in her chest had become too heavy to carry. She remembered the 3 weeks after the Alderton party. She had gone back to her family estate and spent those days being the steady daughter, managing the accounts and the servants, while her heart felt like it had been hollowed out with a silver spoon. At the end of those 3 weeks, she had sat down and written that seating chart. She had given the king to another woman because she couldn't bear to watch him fall in love from a distance. She had decided that if she couldn't be his light, she would at least ensure he wasn't in the dark. But now the truth was out. The king knew. Julian knew. And Seraphina, poor sweet Seraphina, was wearing a crown that was never hers to keep. Evangeline picked up her pen one last time. She didn't write Dear Alaric. She didn't write Your Majesty. She wrote, The throne is a lonely place for a woman who has forgotten how to want. Suddenly there was a sharp knock at her door. Not the polite rap of a servant, but the demanding strike of a man who owned the stone beneath her feet. She stood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened the door, and there he was, King Alaric Thorne. His royal coat discarded his white shirt open at the collar, his eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with duty. You crossed out your name, he said, stepping into her room and closing the door behind him with a finality that made the air hum. I did, she whispered her back against the door. Why did you think I would want anyone else? He was inches away now. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer force of his presence. I saw you, she said, her pride finally breaking. I saw you with her. You laughed. You looked at her as if the world wasn't a cold place anymore. I am the steady one, Alaric. I am the one who manages the problems. Seraphina is the one who brings the light. I thought you needed the light. Alaric reached out his hand, coming up to rest against the door beside her head. He leaned in his voice, a low, rough growl. I don't need a light, Evangeline. I have lived in the dark for 5 years. I need someone who knows how to stand in the storm with me. I need the woman who was brave enough to give away a kingdom because she thought it would make me happy. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. Theodora told me about the heather. She told me what you said in the conservatory. You misread a man's grief for his love, and you built a wall of silk and secrets between us. I was protecting you, she gasped. You were robbing me, he countered. You robbed me of 18 months. You robbed this kingdom of its true queen, and you robbed yourself of the only thing you ever truly wanted." He looked down at her lips, then back at her eyes. "Are you going to keep managing the court, Evangeline? Or are you finally going to tell me what you want?" Evangeline looked at the king, the man she had loved in silence while the world bowed to another. She thought of the seating chart, the royal seal, and the crown she had tried to throw away. "I want to stop being the steady one," she said, her voice finally breaking into a flame. Alaric didn't wait for her to finish. He crashed his lips against hers, a kiss that tasted of 18 months of longing, of anger, and of a power that was finally irrevocably united. But as they stood in the shadows of her room, neither of them saw the figure standing in the hallway. Lady Seraphina was there, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a realization that would change the coronation forever. The wrong woman was wearing the crown, and she was the only one who knew how to stop the wedding. The morning after the king's visit, the gardens of Thornbury were encased in a brittle layer of frost. The hedges looked like jagged glass, and the air bit at any exposed skin with the ruthlessness of a palace executioner. Evangeline walked the stone path toward the conservatory, her spine straight, her velvet cloak heavy enough to hide the trembling of her hands. She needed the quiet of the green things. She needed to breathe air that didn't taste of Alaric's kiss or the suffocating weight of the truth. But the conservatory was not empty. Lady Seraphina stood near the back wall, her fingers tracing the delicate frozen petals of a winter rose. She was wearing the Thornbury emeralds, the jewels that historically belonged to the queen-in-waiting. They looked wrong on her. Too heavy, too old, like a yoke of gold around a swan's neck. "You look as though you haven't slept, Evangeline," Seraphina said, not turning around. Her voice, usually as sweet as spun sugar, carried a sharp, crystalline edge. "Few people in this palace sleep well these days, Seraphina," Evangeline replied, stopping by a cluster of night-blooming jasmine. Seraphina turned. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red. "I saw him. Last night. I saw the king leave your chambers. I saw the way he looked at the door even after he had closed it, like a man who had finally found the heir he was dying for." Evangeline felt the corset tighten around her ribs. She didn't deny it. To deny it would be an insult to the fire she had felt in Alaric's touch. "He came to discuss a misunderstanding, one that has lasted 18 months too long. A misunderstanding." Seraphina stepped forward, the emeralds clinking against her collarbone. "You gave me his hand, Evangeline. You sat me beside him at the Midsummer Gala. You coached me on his favorite poets, his preferred wines, the way he likes to talk about the southern coast. You handed me a crown as if it were a bouquet of dying flowers. And now, weeks before the coronation, you want it back." "I never wanted it back." Evangeline's voice was as cold as the frost outside. "I thought I was giving him what he needed. I thought I was giving him happiness. I was wrong. I was arrogant enough to decide for him, and I was foolish enough to believe that my own heart didn't matter." "And what of my heart?" Seraphina's voice rose, a desperate, fractured sound. "I am the one the people expect to see on that throne. I am the one Julian has built his alliances upon. If the king casts me aside for you now, the court will tear us both apart. They will call you a seductress, and they will call me a failure." Evangeline looked at the woman she had considered a friend, the woman she had used as a shield against her own desires. She saw the fear there, but she also saw something else, a flicker of Julian's ambition. "Julian didn't want you to be happy, Seraphina. He wanted you to be a queen so he could be the man behind the throne. We both used you. I am sorry for my part in it, but I will not spend the rest of my life watching a lie sit on the throne of this kingdom." Seraphina reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Evangeline recognized it instantly. It was Princess Alara's flower press. "He told me about this," Seraphina whispered. "The day at Alderton. He told me how his sister died while he was away at school. He told me that my heather drawings reminded him of the last thing she ever touched. I let him believe I drew them out of inspiration. I didn't tell him that you were the one who gave me the sketches to copy. I didn't tell him that you were the one who taught me how to press the stems so they wouldn't break." The silence in the conservatory was absolute. "You lied to him," Evangeline said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "I survived him," Seraphina countered. I did what you told me to do. I made him feel seen. If he loved me for a lie, then that is his tragedy. But he does not get to take the crown away now. Julian has the council. They will not accept a change in the bloodline so close to the anointing. If Alaric tries to name you, his queen, Julian will reveal the Vance family secret. Evangeline's breath hitched. What secret? Serafina smiled a sad, hollow expression. Your father, the Earl, was a careful man, Evangeline, but he wasn't a loyal one. He didn't keep you steady because he valued your strength. He kept you hidden because your mother wasn't a Vance. She was the sister of the late king's rival. You have a claim to this throne that is stronger than Alaric's own, a claim that would make his reign look like a usurpation. Evangeline felt the room spin. Her mother, the woman who had died in a hunting accident when Evangeline was 14, the woman whose portrait had been removed from the gallery the day she was buried. My father, he lied to me. He protected the realm from a civil war, Serafina said. But Julian found the marriage certificates in the old vault. If you take Alaric's hand, Julian will burn the kingdom down with that truth. He will say you seduced the king to steal the throne back for your mother's line. Alaric will be forced to execute you for treason, just to keep his crown. Serafina tucked the flower press back into her gown. Keep your distance, Evangeline. Stay the steady one. Let me wear the crown, and I will ensure you live a long, quiet life in exile. It is the only way he survives. Serafina walked past her, the scent of expensive rose perfume lingering in the cold air. Evangeline stood alone among the frozen plants. She felt the weight of 14 years of lies settling onto her shoulders. She wasn't just a noble woman who had misread a man's heart. She was a hidden heiress, a threat to the very man she loved. She looked down at her hands. They weren't trembling anymore. She reached out and plucked the frozen winter rose from its stem. The thorns bit into her palm, drawing a thin line of royal blood that dripped onto the white marble floor. You think I am afraid of the fire, Julian, she whispered to the empty room. You think I will let my mother's name be buried again? She turned and headed toward the palace gates. She didn't go to Alaric. She didn't go to her father. She went to the royal library, to the one place where the true history of the kingdom was written in ink that couldn't be erased. As she entered the dusty, sun-drenched room, she saw a figure sitting at the back desk. It was Nathaniel Alaric's most loyal advisor, and the man who had been watching the geometry of the court for years. He looked up, and for the first time he didn't look at her with amusement. He looked at her with the solemnity of a man seeing a queen who had finally come home. You found it, didn't you? Nathaniel asked. The seal, Evangeline said, her voice like a command. The one my mother left in the Vance vault. I need to know what it opens. Nathaniel stood and walked toward a heavy, iron-bound chest in the corner of the room. It doesn't open a door, Evangeline. It opens the king's eyes. But once it is open, there is no going back to the silence. Open it, she said. He reached into his robe and pulled out a key. As the lid of the chest creaked open, the light hit a crown made of white gold and pale sapphires, the lost crown of the northern line. Alaric knows, Nathaniel whispered. He has known for 3 days. He wasn't waiting for you to find the truth, Evangeline. He was waiting for you to be brave enough to claim it. He is ready to step down for you. Evangeline stared at the crown. The world she had managed so carefully was gone. In its place was a choice, a life of safety in the shadows, or a war for the throne with the man she loved. The ghost in the garden was no longer Princess Alara. It was the woman Evangeline was meant to be. She reached out and touched the sapphires. They were cold, but they burned with a promise of justice. Tell the king, Evangeline said, her voice echoing through the silent library. The seating chart is finished. There is only one name left on the throne. The council chamber of Thornbury was a room designed to make men feel small. High vaulted ceilings trapped every whisper, and the massive table of black oak was scarred by a century of treaties and death warrants. Duke Julian sat at the far end, his gloved hands steepled beneath his chin. Surrounding him were 6 of the most powerful ministers in the kingdom, men whose loyalties were bought with promises of land and whose fears were fed by Julian's silver tongue. King Alaric stood by the window, his back to the room. He was watching the heavy gray clouds rolling in from the north, smelling the arrival of a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. The coronation is in 4 days. Your Majesty, Julian said, his voice echoing with a synthetic warmth. "The people are already lining the streets. The foreign ambassadors have arrived. Lady Seraphina is preparing her vows, and yet there are rumors, troubling rumors of a change in heart." Alaric turned slowly. The light from the chandeliers caught the sharp edge of his crown, casting a flicker of gold across his cold, unyielding eyes. "The council exists to advise me, Julian, not to dictate the contents of my heart. If there is a change, it is because the truth has finally found its way into this palace." "Truth is a dangerous word in a room full of politicians," Julian countered, leaning forward. "The lords accepted Seraphina because she was the woman Lady Evangeline Vance chose for you. They saw it as an act of unity between the two most powerful houses. If you cast her aside now for Evangeline, they will see it as a whim, a king choosing a mistress over a queen." "Mistress?" Alaric's voice was a low, dangerous growl that made the ministers shift in their seats. "Watch your tongue, Duke. You speak of a woman whose dignity has held this court together while you were busy counting your coins." "I speak of reality." Julian snapped, his composure finally slipping. "The council will not ratify the marriage. If you attempt to crown Evangeline, we will invoke the Act of Succession. We will demand an inquiry into her mother's lineage. Do you really want the ghosts of the Northern Rebellion dragged through the mud of this court? Do you want her executed for a claim she didn't even ask for?" Alaric walked toward the table, each footstep sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. He leaned over the table, his face inches from Julian's. "You think you can threaten me with her life? You think I would let you touch a single hair on her head?" "I don't have to touch her," Julian whispered so low only the king could hear. "The law will do it for me. Step back, Alaric. Marry my sister. Let Evangeline remain the steady pillar in the shadows and everyone lives. Choose her, and you sign her death warrant." Alaric straightened his jaw, locked. He looked at the ministers, seeing the greed and the fear reflected in their eyes. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for a woman. He was fighting for the very soul of his kingdom. "The council is dismissed," Alaric said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Sire," one of the ministers started. "Dismissed," the king roared. As the men filed out, Julian stayed for a moment, a smirk playing on his lips. 4 days, Alaric. Don't be the king who burned a kingdom for a ghost." While the shadow of the usurper grew in the council chamber, Evangeline was moving through the servant tunnels of the palace, the hidden veins of Thornbury that she had mapped in her mind years ago. She was no longer wearing the sapphire silk gown. She wore a heavy traveling cloak of charcoal wool, her hair pulled back in a severe practical knot. She reached the Vance vault located deep beneath the east wing. It was a cold, damp place that smelled of ancient dust and forgotten loyalty. She held the royal seal her mother had left her, a heavy piece of silver engraved with a soaring hawk, the symbol of the northern line. She pressed it into the indentation of the vault door. The stone groaned, retreating with a heavy grinding sound. Inside, there were no piles of gold or jewels. There was only a single iron-bound chest and a portrait covered in a rotting silk shroud. Evangeline pulled the shroud away. She gasped. The woman in the portrait was her own reflection, but with eyes that held the fire of 1,000 suns. Her mother, Queen Elena of the North, wearing the white gold crown. Behind her stood Evangeline's father, looking not like an earl, but like a man who had sold his soul to keep a secret. Evangeline opened the chest. Inside was the evidence Julian thought he could use as a weapon. The marriage certificate, yes, but also a letter from the Tienvuong late King Alaric's father. She read the words, her eyes stinging in the dim light of her lantern. Asterisk to my son's future. If the hawk and the lion ever find their way back to one another, do not let the laws of men break them. Elena's daughter is not a threat to the throne. She is the throne's salvation. The blood of the North is the only thing that can temper the fire of the Thorne line. Asterisk. Alaric's father hadn't feared her mother. He had protected her. He had intended for Alaric and Evangeline to rule together, to heal the rift that had nearly destroyed the kingdom 20 years ago. It was her own father, the Earl, who had buried the truth. He hadn't done it to protect the realm. He had done it because he was terrified of the power his own daughter possessed. He had wanted a steady daughter, because a queen would have been beyond his control. You were never the steady one, Evangeline, she whispered to the cold air. You were the hidden one. She tucked the letter and the seal into her cloak. She knew now what she had to do. She couldn't wait for Alaric to save her. She couldn't let him sacrifice his crown or his life for a woman who was still hiding. She emerged from the tunnels near the royal stables. The moon was a sliver of ice in the black sky. Leaving so soon, Lady Evangeline? She froze. Standing by the stable door was Nathaniel, his cloak billowing in the wind. I have to go to the northern lords, she said, her voice unshakable. If Julian wants to use my blood against Alaric, I will give him the blood he fears. I will bring the north to the coronation. Nathaniel didn't move to stop her. Instead, he stepped aside and opened the stable door, revealing a horse already saddled and ready for a long journey. The king sent me, Nathaniel said softly. He knew you wouldn't sit and wait for a cage to close around you. He told me to tell you, the chessboard is yours. Move the queen. Evangeline looked at the horse, then back at the palace lights where Alaric was likely standing on his balcony, looking out into the dark. Tell him, Evangeline said as she mounted the horse, that the next time he sees me, I will not be kneeling. She spurred the horse into a gallop, disappearing into the swirling snow and the shadows of the forest. Back in the palace, Alaric stood on his balcony, his hand gripping the cold stone railing until his knuckles turned white. He watched the distant silhouette of a rider vanishing toward the northern mountains. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in 5 years, the weight of the crown felt light. Bring me the royal sealer, Alaric commanded the guard at the door, and call Lady Seraphina to the throne room. It is time we discuss the seating arrangement for the end of the world. The shadow of the usurper was long, but the dawn was coming, and it was carrying a queen who had stopped being steady and started being a storm. The eve of coronation was a night of forced smiles and lethal whispers. The great hall of Thornbury was transformed into a sea of gold and white, the colors of the Thorne dynasty, but the atmosphere was as brittle as thin ice over a black lake. Duke Julian moved through the crowd with the confidence of a kingmaker, his eyes scanning the room for the one person who shouldn't be there. Seraphina sat on a raised dais, her face a mask of pale perfection. The Thornbury emeralds around her neck seemed to pulse with an uneasy light. She looked every bit the queen the council demanded, and yet she was holding her wineglass so tightly that her knuckles were white. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open. The herald didn't announce her. He didn't have to. The room fell silent, as if the air itself had been sucked out. Evangeline Vance didn't walk. She reclaimed the floor. She was no longer in the charcoal cloak of a fugitive. She wore a gown of midnight velvet, embroidered with silver threads that shimmered like stars. On her breast, pinned clearly for every minister and noble to see, was the royal seal of the northern line, the hawk of Elena's house. She didn't head for the king. She headed for the chessboard that had been set up in the center of the hall, a traditional centerpiece for the night before a coronation. Alaric, who had been standing by the throne, moved toward her. His face was a fortress of royal calm, but his amber eyes burned with a pride so fierce it almost made Evangeline falter. He reached the table at the same moment she did. "You returned," Alaric said, his voice echoing in the absolute silence. "I promised I would not be kneeling when we met again." "Your Majesty," Evangeline replied, her voice steady, elegant, and loud enough for the council to hear. "The game is set, Lady Evangeline," Julian said, stepping into the circle, his voice dripping with false concern. "But you are playing with a seal that hasn't been recognized by this court in 20 years. To wear it is an act of defiance. To claim its power is treason. To hide its power was the real treason, Julian," Evangeline countered, her eyes locking onto his. "I am not here to defy the king. I am here to fulfill the will of the one who came before him." She reached out and picked up the black queen. She moved it across the board, bypassing the knights and the bishops, and placed it directly in front of the king's pawn. "An opening," Alaric murmured, his hand hovering over the board. "A commitment," she corrected. For the next 20 minutes, the entire court of Thornbury watched a game that was not about ivory pieces. Each move was a strike at an alliance, a revelation of a hidden truth. "You build toward a commitment, and then you withdraw, Evangeline," Alaric said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've done it for 18 months. Is this another withdrawal, I am tired of protecting a position that was built on lies, she said, her fingers grazing the white gold of her seal. I am advancing. She moved her rook, pinning Julian's metaphorical influence on the board. The ministers around the table began to murmur. They saw the seal. They saw the way Alaric looked at her, not as a king looking at a subject, but as a man looking at his equal. Julian's face darkened. He realized the northern lords were not in the room, but their influence was. Evangeline's presence here wearing that seal meant she had already secured the border. If he struck her now, the North would march before the sun rose on the coronation. The bloodline is the law, Julian shouted, abandoning his cool veneer. The council has ruled. Seraphina is the chosen bride. You're a hidden heir of a deadline, Evangeline. You have no place on that throne. Alaric stepped around the table. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at Evangeline. He reached out his gloved hand, covering hers on the chessboard, steadying the queen she was about to move. The bloodline is the heart of the kingdom, Alaric declared, his voice booming through the hall. And the heart of this kingdom was nearly broken by a secret kept in the dark. Lady Evangeline Vance is the daughter of the North. She is the legacy my father swore to protect. He turned to the room, his hand still holding hers. The coronation tomorrow will proceed, but the woman who wears the crown will not be the one you chose out of fear. She will be the one who was born to it. Seraphina stood up on the dais, her chair clattering against the stone. Alaric, stop! The room held its breath. Seraphina walked down the steps, her emeralds flashing. She stopped in front of Evangeline. The two women stood face to face, the woman who had been given everything, and the woman who had sacrificed everything. I cannot do it, Seraphina whispered, her voice trembling. She reached up and unclasped the thornberry emeralds. She held them out to Evangeline. I saw him look at the door last night. I saw the truth in the flower press. I will not be the wrong woman on a stolen throne. Julian let out a strangled cry of rage. Seraphina, sit down! No, Julian, Seraphina said, her voice finally finding its strength. You used my love for this kingdom to feed your greed. You told me Evangeline would be executed if I didn't take the crown. You lied to me. You lied to everyone. She placed the emeralds on the chessboard right beside Evangeline's black queen. The game is over, brother, Seraphina said. Alaric looked at Julian, his eyes cold and final. Guards, escort the Duke to the tower. He will wait there until the High Court can hear the evidence of his threats against the true heir. As the guards moved in, Julian struggled, but the ministers who had been whispering in his ear only minutes ago now stepped back, their faces pale, with the sudden realization of where the power truly lay. The hall was empty of soldiers within moments, leaving only the king, the woman he loved, and a court that was slowly, tentatively beginning to bow. Alaric didn't let go of Evangeline's hand. He led her to the center of the room beneath the great chandelier. You moved the queen, he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. I had to, she said, her eyes wet with tears of relief. I couldn't let you be a king in a kingdom of shadows. Now you know how it feels, he said, repeating the words she had once told him in the conservatory. To be seen, to be chosen. I'm not asking for more than a beginning, Alaric. You have the crown, Evangeline. You have the kingdom. But more than that, he leaned in his voice, a soft velvet promise. You have the man who has been waiting for you to stop being steady and start being mine. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The clouds parted, revealing a silver moon that bathed Thornbury Palace in a light that felt like justice. But as the court began to celebrate, Evangeline looked at the chessboard one last time. The Black Queen was standing tall, but the game of the crown was never truly finished. There were still lords in the shadows, and the history of the northern line was written in blood as much as sapphire. Are you ready for tomorrow? Alaric asked. Evangeline straightened her spine, her hand tightening around the royal seal. I have spent 14 years being the steady one, Alaric. I think I am ready to be the one who rules. The chessboard was left behind, the pieces frozen in a victory that would change the map of the world. The air in the king's private sanctum was heavy with the smell of old parchment, cold iron, and the weight of secrets that had been buried for a generation. Evangeline stood before the massive stone hearth, the northern seal gripped so tightly in her palm that the silver edges left a permanent mark on her skin. She wasn't alone. Her father, the Earl of Vance, stood in the shadows of the arched doorway. He looked smaller than she remembered the candlelight, catching the deep lines of guilt and exhaustion on his face. This was the man who had assigned her the duty of steadiness at 14, the man who had spent 14 years making sure she never looked at a crown. "You should have stayed in the north of Evangeline," the Earl said, his voice a dry rasp. "The mountains were safe. The shadows were kind. Here there is only the fire that consumed your mother." "My mother didn't die in a hunting accident, did she?" "Father!" Evangeline turned her gaze as sharp as a royal decree. "The hawk does not fall to a stray arrow. She was hunted." The Earl closed his eyes, leaning heavily against a bookshelf. "The northern line was the only threat to the Thorne dynasty. When your mother married me, it was supposed to be an end to the wars. But the council, they feared her blood. They feared the way the people looked at her with more love than they gave the king. They didn't want a queen of the north. They wanted a ghost. So you buried her," Evangeline whispered, her voice trembling with a fury that felt like ice. "And then you buried me. You told me to be steady. You told me to manage the room so I would never lead them. You watched me give away my own heart to Alaric, because you were afraid that if I stood beside him, the kingdom would remember who I truly am." "I did it to keep you alive," the Earl roared, stepping into the light. "Julian isn't the first man to use your bloodline as a weapon. Every minister in that hall has a knife hidden for the northern line. If Alaric crowns you, he isn't just taking a wife. He is starting a revolution. Is your love worth the blood of every soldier in this city?" Evangeline walked toward him, her footsteps echoing on the cold stone. She reached into her velvet cloak and pulled out the letter she had found in the vault, the one signed by Alaric's father. "The Tien Vuong didn't want a revolution, father. He wanted a restoration," she said, holding the letter before his eyes. "He knew that the Thorne line was burning itself out with coldness. He knew the North was the only thing that could save this kingdom. He didn't want me hidden. He wanted me prepared." She moved to the king's desk and picked up a heavy black cylinder, the royal ledger of seals. She pressed her mother's silver hawk into the wax seal at the bottom of the final page, a page that had remained blank for 2 decades. The seal didn't just leave a mark, it triggered a mechanism. A small hidden drawer in the desk slid open, revealing a scroll wrapped in the colors of the northern line, white and sapphire. Evangeline unfurled it. It wasn't a marriage certificate. It was an abdication and a gift. Alaric's father had signed over the northern territories to his son's future bride, effectively making the Queen of the North a sovereign ruler in her own right, independent of the Thorne Council's veto power. "He gave me the power to override Julian before I was even born," Evangeline realized, her voice hushed with awe. "This isn't about being Alaric's wife. This is about being the sovereign of the North. If I marry him as a sovereign, the council has no legal grounds to stop the coronation. The act of succession doesn't apply to a union of 2 crowns. The Earl stared at the scroll, his face turning ashen. He bypassed the council 20 years ago. He knew this day would come. He knew that Alaric would need a queen who was his equal, not his subject, Evangeline said, her spine straightening as the last of her doubts vanished. "You spent 14 years teaching me how to manage people, father. You thought you were making me a servant of the court, but you were actually teaching me how to rule it. You gave me the very tools I need to destroy Julian's rebellion." "Evangeline, listen to me." The Earl reached for her hand, his eyes desperate. "Julian will still strike. He has the tower guards. He has the treasury. And I have the truth," she countered, pulling her hand away. "And I have the king." Suddenly, the doors to the sanctum were thrown open. Alaric stood there, his sword drawn, his face a mask of royal fury. Behind him stood Nathaniel and a small group of loyalist soldiers. "The council is moving," Alaric said, his eyes scanning the room until they found Evangeline. "Julian has escaped the tower. He has convinced the archbishop that your bloodline makes the coronation a sacrilege. They are heading for the chapel now to crown Serafina by force before the sun rises." Evangeline didn't panic. She didn't retreat. She picked up the sovereign scroll and the northern seal. "Let them go to the chapel," she said, her voice ringing with an elegant, terrifying power. "Let the archbishop prepare the oil and the crown. We will give them the ceremony they want. But the woman who walks down that aisle will not be the one they expect." Alaric moved to her side, his hand settling on the hilt of his sword, but his eyes were fixed on her with a devotion that transcended the throne. "You are sure about this?" "Once we reveal the Sovereign Scroll, there is no going back to the life you knew. You will never be the steady one again." "I am finished with steadiness, Alaric," Evangeline said, her hand reaching up to touch the royal seal on her breast. "I am the North, and it is time the South remembered what happens when the North wakes up." Alaric turned to Nathaniel. "Prepare the royal carriage. No guards in uniform. We go as shadows until we reach the chapel gates. And Nathaniel—" "Yes, sire." "Bring the white gold crown from the vault, the one with the sapphires. The Thornbury emeralds are no longer sufficient for the woman I intend to crown." As they moved toward the secret exit, the Earl of Vance watched them go, his head bowed in the darkness. He had tried to bury the hawk to save the girl, but the girl had become the hawk anyway. The palace was silent as they descended into the tunnels, but in the distance the bells of the great chapel began to toll a frantic, uneven rhythm that signaled the beginning of a coup. Evangeline sat in the shadows of the carriage, her fingers interlaced with Alaric's. The cold marble of the palace was behind her. The uncertainty of the garden was gone. Ahead lay the throne room, the court and the public justice she had waited a lifetime to claim. "Are you afraid?" Alaric whispered as the carriage jolted toward the chapel. Evangeline looked out the window at the first light of dawn hitting the cathedral spires. "No," she said, her voice a calm, lethal blade. "I'm just wondering how Julian will look when he realizes he brought a knife to a war of crowns." The carriage slowed as it reached the heavy iron gates of the chapel. The world was about to see a queen comeback that would be whispered about for centuries. The seal was broken, the truth was out, and the kingdom was about to bow. The great chapel of Thornbury was a mountain of white stone and stained glass, designed to make even kings feel like dust before the divine. As the first rays of a winter dawn pierced through the high windows, the air inside was thick with the scent of holy incense and the terrified silence of 1,000 nobles. At the altar stood the archbishop, his gold robes heavy with the weight of tradition. Beside him, Duke Julian stood with his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes darting toward the heavy iron doors. He had occupied the chapel with his personal guard, a desperate move to force a coronation before the king could intervene. Seraphina stood at the foot of the altar, draped in white silk, her head bowed. She looked less like a bride and more like a sacrifice. "By the law of the council and the blood of the Thorne dynasty," the archbishop began, his voice echoing through the hollow stone, "we gather to crown." The law of the council is a lie when written by a traitor's hand. The voice didn't come from the king. It came from the back of the chapel. The massive iron doors swung open with a sound like a thunderclap. Evangeline Vance stood in the doorway. She was no longer a shadow, no longer the steady lady of the court. She wore a mantle of midnight blue velvet lined with ermine, and the white gold crown of the northern line rested upon her brow, its sapphires catching the morning light like frozen fire. Beside her stood King Alaric, his black armor gleaming, his hand not on his sword, but holding hers. The court gasped. A wave of movement swept through the pews as nobles rose, their whispers rising like a swarm of bees. "Guards!" Julian roared, pointing a trembling finger at the doorway. "Arrest the pretender! Arrest the woman who steals the northern seal!" But the guards did not move. They looked at the king, then at the woman beside him, and then at the royal sealer Nathaniel, who walked behind them carrying the sovereign scroll. "The only pretender in this house is the man who tried to bury a queen." Alaric's voice was a roar of controlled fury. He marched down the center aisle, pulling Evangeline with him, their footsteps striking the marble in a rhythm of inevitable justice. They reached the altar. Julian stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "You cannot do this. Alaric, the act of succession forbids a northern heir from the throne." "The act of succession applies to subjects, Julian," Evangeline said, her voice calm, lethal, and carrying to the farthest corner of the chapel. She stepped past the king and stood directly before the archbishop. "I do not stand here as a subject of the Thorne line. I stand here as the sovereign of the North by the decree of the Tien Vuong himself." She took the sovereign scroll from Nathaniel and laid it upon the altar. "Read it, Archbishop," she commanded. Read the words that have been hidden for 20 years, while my mother's name was dragged through the dust." The archbishop's hands trembled as he unfurled the parchment. As his eyes scanned the royal seal of the late king, his face went pale. He looked at the court, then at the duke, and finally he bowed his head. "The seal is authentic," the archbishop whispered. "The northern line is sovereign. This is not a coronation of a consort. This is the union of two crowns." Julian lunged for the scroll, but Alaric was faster. The king's hand clamped around Julian's throat, slamming him back against the cold stone of the altar. "You threatened her life," Alaric growled, his voice a promise of death. "You lied to your sister. You betrayed your king. You're no longer a duke. You're a ghost." Alaric threw him to the floor, where the royal guards finally moved, dragging Julian away as he screamed curses that were swallowed by the high vaulted ceiling. Seraphina stepped forward, her eyes wet with tears. She knelt before Evangeline, the Thornberry emeralds in her outstretched hands. "I told you I would step aside," Seraphina whispered. "I'm sorry it took a storm to bring you home." Evangeline took the emeralds and handed them to Nathaniel. She looked at Seraphina and saw not a rival, but a woman who had also been a prisoner of the steady lie. "Rise, Seraphina. You are not a failure. You were the only one brave enough to speak the truth when it mattered." Then the chapel went silent. King Alaric turned to Evangeline. He took the white gold crown from her head and held it up before the people. "5 years ago I took this throne in silence and grief," Alaric declared. "I thought a king had to be cold to be strong. I thought the crown was a burden to be carried alone. I was wrong." He knelt. The king of the Thorne dynasty, the man who had never bowed to any soul, knelt on the cold marble before Evangeline Vance. "Evangeline," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion that made the oldest duchesses in the room weep. "You were the one who held this kingdom together when I was too blind to see the shadows. You gave up your name to save my heart. Today I ask you not to be my subject, but to be my sovereign. Will you rule with me?" Evangeline looked down at the king. She thought of the 14 years of silence, the seating charts she had burned, the name she had crossed out, and the cold marble that had once been the only thing she knew. She reached out and took the crown from his hands. She didn't put it on her own head. She placed it on the altar beside the thorn crown. "I will not rule behind you, Alaric," she said, her voice echoing with the power of 1,000 years of northern blood. "And I will not rule in front of you. I will rule beside you." She offered him her hand. He took it and rose. Together they turned to face the court. "The Queen of the North!" Nathaniel shouted, his voice cracking with pride. "The Queen of the Thorne, long live the sovereigns!" A roar went up from the chapel. It wasn't the polite applause of a court. It was the sound of a kingdom that had finally found its soul. One by one, the ministers who had plotted with Julian, the lords, who had whispered in the dark, and the ladies who had doubted the steady girl, all fell to their knees. The entire kingdom bowed. As they walked out of the chapel and into the blinding light of the winter sun, the bells began to ring again, this time in a perfect, joyous harmony. Evangeline felt the weight of the silver hawk on her breast and the warmth of Alaric's hand in hers. She looked out at the crowds lining the streets, the people who were shouting her name, her true name. "Are you happy, my queen?" Alaric whispered as they reached the royal carriage. Evangeline looked at the horizon where the mountains of the north met the plains of the south in a single, unbroken line. "No," she said with a small, elegant smile. "I am something better than happy, Alaric. I am home." The carriage door closed, and the sovereigns of the United Crowns drove into a future that was no longer managed, but lived. The seating chart was gone. The shadows were empty. And on the throne of Thornberry, there was finally enough room for a woman who had stopped being steady and started being legendary.